A summer night, sometime around the turn of the 20th century. An American family's house has been soaking up heat all day, and long after the sun has gone down, the walls and the air inside are still holding on to it. Every window in the house is open. Nobody is trying to keep the outside air out. They are trying to catch every bit of it they can. There is no dial to turn, no machine to switch on, no single fix waiting in another room. Whatever relief this family gets tonight will come from where they choose to sit, how the air happens to be moving, and how the house itself was built decades earlier by someone who had to think seriously about exactly this problem. Someone is sitting out on the porch, because the porch, right now, is a cooler place to be than the bedroom. Someone else may end up sleeping there tonight, or on a screened-in porch built specifically for that purpose, because the inside of the house has simply not let go of the day's heat yet. Here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. If there was no way to mechanically cool a room, what did people actually do when the summer heat followed them indoors? The answer is not simply that they suffered quietly through it. Their houses, their daily habits, and even their evenings outside were built, deliberately, around the fact that summer air could not be switched off, in ways a modern viewer, used to a thermostat on the wall, rarely has any real occasion to think about. This story's title says America had no air conditioning until 1902. That needs a quick correction before we go any further, because the plain version of that sentence overstates things. Ice, hand fans, mechanical ice making, and early cooling experiments already existed well before 1902, and plenty of Americans would have said, if asked, that they already had ways of coping with the heat. What arrived that year was something more specific. The first modern, electrically powered air conditioning system, the true starting point of the technology as we would recognize it today. And it did not arrive because someone was uncomfortable in the summer heat. It arrived because a printing company in Brooklyn could not keep its paper the right size. We will get to that. But first, it helps to understand just how much work the old system of staying cool actually required. Because it was never just one thing. It was many small mechanisms working together. Start with the building itself. A porch was not simply a place to relax. It created shade against the walls of the house and gave people a shaded outdoor space with better airflow than the rooms behind it. A deep porch roof also kept direct summer sun from ever reaching the windows and walls behind it in the first place, which mattered more than it might sound, since a wall baking in direct sunlight all afternoon radiates that heat into the rooms behind it long after dark. Windows placed on multiple sides of a room allowed cross-ventilation, letting a breeze actually move through a space instead of just sitting at one open window doing very little. A house with windows on only one wall could open every one of them and still barely move the air inside, while a house with openings on opposite sides let outdoor air actually flow through, carrying heat back out with it. Some houses were built with high ceilings or vents positioned to let hot air rise up and out of the rooms people actually occupied, since heat naturally collects near the top of a room. Awnings and shutters existed specifically to block direct sun before it ever reached the glass and warmed the room behind it. A well-placed shade tree could measurably cool the walls and roof of a house, simply by keeping direct sunlight off them for part of the day. None of these features appeared in every American home. Climate, region, era, and a family's income all shaped how much of this system a given house actually had. A modest house in a hot, humid region might rely heavily on porches and cross-ventilation. A grander house might add shutters, deep eaves, or a sleeping porch built specifically for hot nights. The point is not that every house had everything. It is that cooling itself was distributed, spread out across dozens of small architectural decisions rather than concentrated in one machine. Behavior filled in the rest of what the building alone could not solve. Before mechanical cooling, comfort in summer usually meant changing where you were, not changing a number on a dial. Families moved their evenings outdoors once the sun went down, sitting on porches, stoops, or in yards where neighbors were often doing exactly the same thing, turning a shared discomfort into a shared evening ritual. People adjusted clothing for the heat, and household routines often shifted too, with heavier chores or cooking pushed to cooler parts of the day whenever a family had that flexibility. Hand fans, and later small electric fans once they became available, kept air moving directly across the skin, which helped the body cool itself even when the air itself was not actually getting any cooler. Ice played its own role here too, arriving by wagon in many American towns to keep food and drinks cold, offering the kind of localized relief a block of ice sitting in an icebox could provide, even though nobody yet had any practical way to use that same ice to cool an entire occupied room. The contrast with today is worth stating plainly. A modern person facing a hot night simply changes the thermostat. Before mechanical cooling, a person facing that same hot night changed almost everything else instead: where they sat, where they slept, how they dressed, and when, during the day, they were willing to be indoors at all. It would be a mistake, though, to romanticize any of this as some clever, fully sufficient solution to summer heat. The porch and the open window only helped if the outside air itself was actually offering some relief. On a night when the outdoor air stayed hot, when humidity was high, when a family lived crowded into a dense city block or worked inside a factory full of running machinery, this whole passive system simply ran into a hard physical limit. No amount of open windows can make the air inside a room colder than the air already sitting outside it. And this was not merely an inconvenience. Extreme heat carried a real, measurable human cost throughout this period. One influential economic study of American temperature and mortality over the 20th century found that the danger posed by very hot days to human life was substantially higher in the early decades of that century than in later ones, and the researchers behind that study identified the spread of residential air conditioning as the single largest factor behind the dramatic decline that followed. We are not there yet in this story, but it is worth knowing, even now, that the stakes here were never purely about comfort. So the old system had real limits. But it is worth asking a different, more surprising question at this point. If Americans could already manufacture ice by machine well before 1902, why wasn't every house already cool? In the 1830s and 1840s, a Florida physician named John Gorey began experimenting with artificial cooling, hoping to ease the suffering of patients in his care during hot, disease-prone summers. Gorey's earliest attempts actually relied on shipping natural ice down from frozen lakes in the north, an expensive and unreliable supply chain for a Florida hospital in the middle of summer. That logistical headache pushed him toward a different idea entirely, making his own ice on site, rather than depending on ice that had to survive a long trip south before it ever reached his patients. In 1851, he secured a patent for a machine that could manufacture ice using mechanical compression, powered by a horse, water power, sails, or steam, rather than depending on shipments of natural ice cut from frozen lakes up north. Gorey's own financial backer died before the invention could ever reach the market, and the idea of artificial cooling largely stagnated for decades afterward, with no company willing to take on the financial risk of manufacturing his machines at scale. But his patent proves an important point for this story. The basic problem of producing artificial ice had already been demonstrated and patented in America half a century before 1902. What remained unsolved was something different, and, it turns out, considerably harder: reliably conditioning the air inside an occupied room, for hours at a stretch, rather than simply making a block of ice in a workshop. That harder problem finally met its answer in 1902, and not for the reason most people assume. Willis Carrier, a young engineer barely a year out of Cornell, was working for the Buffalo Forge Company when he was assigned to solve a very specific industrial headache at the Sackett-Wilhelm's Lithographing and Publishing Company, a printing plant in Brooklyn. Humidity in the plant's air was causing paper to expand and contract as it moved through the presses, which threw off the alignment of the different colors being printed on top of each other, ruining page after page. The stakes for the printing company were entirely commercial, not medical or personal. Ruined color registration meant wasted paper, wasted ink, and a serious production problem if the issue could not be solved before the next summer's humid months arrived. Nobody at Sackett-Wilhelm's was asking for a more pleasant place to work. They were asking an engineer to fix a production defect. Carrier's insight was that if he could precisely control the humidity in the air, he could solve the printing company's registration problem directly. He designed a system that passed air over cooling coils, which chilled the air enough to force some of its moisture to condense out, giving him control over both temperature and humidity at the same time. He later secured a patent for an apparatus for treating air, issued in 1906. The 1902 system itself is generally regarded today as the first modern electrical air conditioning system. This is worth pausing on because it overturns the assumption most people bring to this story. Modern air conditioning was not invented because a human being was miserably hot and wanted relief. It was invented because a factory could not keep its printed pages properly aligned. Human comfort was, for years afterward, a side effect of an industrial engineering problem, not the goal Carrier originally set out to solve. It is worth sitting with just how unglamorous that origin really was. No one commissioned Carrier to invent a way to make American summers more bearable. A printing company simply needed its ink to line up correctly, page after page, regardless of how humid the Brooklyn air happened to be that week, and solving that narrow, specific complaint turned out to unlock something far bigger than anyone in that print shop could have anticipated. And this points to something deeper about what air conditioning actually is, which is easy to miss if you only think of it as a machine that makes air cold. A window fan can move air around a room, but it cannot remove moisture from that air or bring its temperature down to a controlled, predictable level. Carrier's real breakthrough was learning how to manage temperature and humidity together as a single coordinated system, rather than treating either one in isolation. Warm, humid air passing over Carrier's chilled coils cooled down, and once it cooled enough, some of the water vapor it was carrying condensed out of it entirely, the same way moisture beads up on a cold glass of water on a summer afternoon. That single physical process let him control two things his industrial clients cared about at once, not just one. That combination is what let engineers begin manufacturing something new, a predictable, repeatable indoor atmosphere built to a specification rather than left to whatever the weather outside happened to be doing that day. That is precisely why the technology spread so quickly through industries that had nothing to do with human comfort at all. Textile mills needed stable humidity to keep thread from breaking during spinning. Tobacco processors needed controlled moisture to handle leaf properly. Carrier's own early clients were factories and industrial processes, not families looking for a cooler bedroom, because the value of his invention, at first, was entirely about controlling a production process, not about how comfortable anyone happened to feel. Over the following years, similar systems were showing up in bakeries, pharmaceutical plants, and munitions factories, each with its own specific reason to want air held at a stable temperature and humidity, rather than left to drift with the seasons. The common thread running through all of these early customers was production quality, not personal comfort, which is precisely why human cooling took so many additional years to become the industry's main selling point. The name for all of this actually arrived a few years after the technology itself. In 1906, textile mill owner Stuart W. Kramer, working on humidity control in his North Carolina mills, used the term air conditioning in a patent claim to describe the process of managing moisture and changing the air in textile factories. Carrier himself later adopted the phrase. It is a small, almost amusing detail, but worth knowing. The industry existed and was already solving real problems for several years before it even had the name we still use for it today. For a while, the technology stayed almost entirely industrial. The moment it reached the American public in a meaningful way came in 1904, when engineers used mechanical refrigeration to cool the Missouri State Building at the World's Fair in St. Louis, circulating tens of thousands of cubic feet of chilled air through the structure every minute. Fairgoers who stepped inside got their first real taste of something most of them had never experienced: comfort cooling in a large public space, on a hot day, produced entirely by machine. For a visitor who had just spent the afternoon walking the fairgrounds under a Missouri summer sun, stepping through those doors into deliberately cooled air must have felt closer to a magic trick than an engineering demonstration. The real cultural breakthrough, though, came through a very different kind of public space: the movie theater. Early theater cooling systems in the 1910s and 1920s were often crude, essentially heating equipment repurposed with refrigeration attached, pumping cold air through vents in the floor. That approach chilled patrons' feet while leaving the upper part of the theater uncomfortably hot and muggy, and some moviegoers reportedly wrapped newspapers around their legs just to stay warm in the very theater that was supposedly cooling them. Carrier's engineers fixed that specific design flaw in 1922, installing a properly designed cooling system at the Metropolitan Theater in Los Angeles that pushed cool air through higher vents instead, producing comfortable, even temperatures throughout the building rather than one freezing zone and one sweltering one. Picture the scene this created outside almost any theater with a system like this. A sweltering city sidewalk in July, a marquee promising an afternoon matinee, and behind those doors, something the sidewalk itself could never offer: air that had been deliberately, mechanically made comfortable. For a couple of hours, ticket in hand, a moviegoer was not simply escaping into a story. They were escaping into a different climate entirely, one nobody outside those doors had any access to at all. Theaters that installed reliable cooling systems in the 1920s helped turn summer from a difficult season for moviegoing into a genuine selling point in its own right. Going to the movies stopped being simply about the film playing that week. For a couple of hours on the hottest day of the year, a theater ticket also bought a different indoor climate than the one waiting outside the door. The same decade brought a second major technical milestone. In 1922, Carrier introduced the Centrifugal Chiller, a design that made large-scale mechanical cooling considerably more practical and efficient than earlier equipment had been. The centrifugal compressor provided a foundation for safer, smaller, more powerful, and more efficient large-scale air conditioning systems, greatly expanding the kinds of public and commercial spaces that could realistically be cooled. If 1902 proved that indoor air could be precisely controlled at all, the centrifugal chiller of the 1920s proved that the same basic idea could be scaled up to cool genuinely large public spaces, like theaters, department stores, and office buildings, at a cost that made economic sense. Given all of this, a reasonable person might expect ordinary American homes to have started filling up with air conditioning almost immediately afterward. That is not remotely what happened, and the reason why sets up one of the more interesting turns in this story. If the technology was this good by the 1920s, why wasn't a typical family putting a unit in their own house that same decade? The honest answer comes down to size, cost, and infrastructure, not any remaining doubt about whether the technology actually worked. Early air conditioning equipment was genuinely enormous, often filling most of a room by itself, and it was priced for factories, theaters, and department stores, not for an ordinary household budget. A workable, compact home unit simply did not exist yet, no matter how badly a family might have wanted one on a hot July night. Smaller, room-sized units did begin appearing in the early 1930s, but they remained expensive relative to an average family's income, closer to a luxury purchase than a routine household appliance. It took further design work over the following years, culminating in more compact and inexpensive window units by the post-war period, before this technology started coming within reach of a genuinely large number of American households, rather than only the wealthiest few. By 1947, roughly 43,000 of these more affordable systems had been sold, a real number, but still a tiny fraction of American homes at the time. To put that figure in perspective, it represented a small fraction of 1% of American households, spread across an entire nation that had already been sweating through summers for more than 3 centuries. Inventing air conditioning in 1902 and making air conditioning ordinary turned out to be two completely different achievements, separated by more than 4 decades of shrinking, cheapening, and re-engineering the same basic idea Carrier had proven in that Brooklyn printing plant. The real transformation came after World War II. Equipment kept getting cheaper. Window units spread rapidly through existing homes across the country. New construction increasingly built central air conditioning directly into the house from the start, rather than treating it as something to add later. Manufacturers who had spent the war years building compressors and cooling equipment for military and industrial use turned that same production capacity toward the civilian market once the war ended, and a growing post-war economy gave more American families the disposable income to actually buy what those factories were now producing in volume. By the late 1960s, most new homes being built in America included central air conditioning as a standard feature, not an unusual upgrade reserved for the wealthy. What had been a rare, expensive novelty when Henry Galson's more affordable window units first reached the market had become, within about 2 decades, close to the default assumption for anyone building a new American home. Return, now, to that family from the opening scene, only picture them a few decades later, in a house built for this newer world. The porch is still there, perhaps, but it is no longer doing the same essential work it once did. Instead of opening every window at dusk and hoping for a breeze, the family closes the windows and turns on a machine. Summer, indoors, has become something engineered rather than something endured or carefully managed room by room. This is the real payoff sitting underneath the whole story. Air conditioning did not simply make the old way of surviving summer more comfortable. Over the following decades, it began replacing that old system almost entirely, taking over a job that had previously been distributed across porches, shade trees, window placement, and daily habits, and concentrating nearly all of it inside a single mechanical box. That shift changed more than personal comfort. It changed what architects felt free to design. Before reliable mechanical cooling, buildings in hot climates generally had to take natural ventilation seriously as a real design constraint, because the building itself was doing a meaningful share of the cooling work. Once mechanical air conditioning became dependable and affordable, architects gained real freedom from that old constraint, increasingly designing buildings around mechanical ventilation systems rather than operable windows and shaded porches. Office buildings offer a particularly clear example of this shift. Some structures built once reliable central air conditioning was assumed from the start were designed with windows that could not open at all, since the building's climate was now entirely the mechanical system's responsibility, rather than something a breeze through an open window needed to help manage. That would have been an almost unthinkable design choice a few decades earlier, when the building itself still had to do real work keeping its occupants tolerably comfortable. It would go too far to claim that air conditioning sealed every American building shut overnight. But the underlying assumption genuinely shifted. Where an older building had to negotiate constantly with the outdoor climate just to remain livable in August, a newer building could increasingly assume the mechanical system would simply handle that problem, freeing the design itself to prioritize other things entirely, deeper floor plans, larger unbroken walls of glass, shapes that would have been miserable to inhabit under the old rules of natural ventilation. The social consequence ran alongside the architectural one. As air conditioning became affordable enough for ordinary households, a meaningful share of everyday summer life quietly moved from the porch into the house. Evenings that once happened outside, in view of neighbors doing the exact same thing on their own porches up and down the street, increasingly happened instead behind closed windows, inside a climate the family itself now controlled. Something genuinely social had depended, without anyone necessarily planning it that way, on the simple fact that summer heat pushed people outdoors and into view of one another almost every evening. Once a comfortable indoor alternative existed, that shared outdoor ritual stopped being a near necessity and became instead a choice a family could easily decide not to make on any given night. It would be an overreach to claim air conditioning alone destroyed American neighborly life, since plenty of other forces reshaped how Americans spent their evenings across these same decades. What can be said clearly is narrower and still significant. Air conditioning changed where summer life actually happened, moving a great deal of it indoors, out of public view, and into a space the household could now keep exactly as cool as it wanted, regardless of what the evening outside actually felt like. Air conditioning also changed where Americans found it practical to live and work in large numbers. Census records show that residential air conditioning was still far from universal as late as 1950, right before many hot-weather metropolitan areas entered decades of rapid population growth. It would be far too simple to say air conditioning alone created that growth, since housing supply, economic opportunity, and other regional advantages all played major roles in the rise of cities across the Sun Belt. Before air conditioning became widespread, extreme summer heat imposed a major practical penalty on year-round indoor life and work in a city like Phoenix. That penalty did not disappear the instant air conditioning existed, but it eroded steadily as the technology became cheaper and more common across the following decades. What is fair to say is narrower and more precise. Air conditioning removed one major practical penalty that had always come with living or working in a very hot climate, making it considerably easier for a growing population, and the businesses that employed them, to settle comfortably in cities like Phoenix, that summer heat alone had once made a genuinely difficult place to build a large, year-round urban economy. Return one final time to the human cost mentioned earlier in this story, because it belongs at the end as much as at the beginning. The same economic research examining 20th century American mortality found something striking. The danger extreme heat posed to human life fell by roughly 80% between the early and later parts of the century covered by that study, and the researchers found that the spread of residential air conditioning accounted for nearly all of that decline. That is the finding of one influential study, not an unquestionable universal law, but it is a serious, carefully researched number worth taking seriously, rather than treating this story as simply a tale about comfort. There is a real trade-off sitting at the end of all of this, and it deserves an honest, unhurried final word. The old passive system, whatever its real limits, was at least designed to work with the climate outside it, catching breezes, blocking sun, releasing heat upward, adapting the house itself to its surroundings. As modern buildings became deeper, more sealed, and more thoroughly dependent on mechanical ventilation, they gained enormous freedom from the outdoor climate. That same freedom also left them newly dependent on the machine actually continuing to run. A serious power outage during a heat wave now presents a real danger in buildings that depend heavily on mechanical cooling and ventilation. A building designed around operable windows and natural airflow may retain more passive options when the power fails, even though it can still become dangerously hot during an extreme heat wave. A porch does not fail when the electrical grid does. A sealed, mechanically ventilated building with no operable windows has considerably fewer options left once the machine keeping it comfortable simply stops. Energy demand for cooling has grown enormously alongside adoption, and the refrigerants these systems depend on have carried their own separate environmental costs, requiring new regulation over the decades since Carrier's original design. None of this erases what air conditioning made possible. It simply means the convenience came bundled with a new kind of dependency that the old, more stubborn system never quite created. Picture that same family one final time on a hot night decades after the one that opened this story. Before mechanical cooling existed, they adapted their house and their entire daily rhythm to summer, where they sat, when they went outside, how the building itself was built to catch or release the heat. After air conditioning became ordinary, that relationship quietly reversed. Increasingly, it was summer itself that had to adapt to the building, reduced to a temperature and a humidity level a machine could simply be set to override. The porch may still stand outside the window. It has simply stopped being load-bearing in any real sense for the family's comfort. The great change that began in 1902 was never really about whether Americans could finally make one room colder on one hot day. It was about learning, for the first time, how to manufacture an indoor climate on demand, on a schedule, at a scale that could eventually reach nearly every home in the country. And across the decades that followed, America quietly built much of ordinary daily life around a single, easy-to-forget assumption that the machine, once turned on, would simply keep running.